Infection prevention and control. Introduction. The expansion of education and training on how to recognize and deal with job-related dangers is absolutely necessary. Disease transmission from patient to patient and from patient to healthcare professional can be a life-threatening hazard. It is now necessary to not have just infection control, but infection prevention and control. Microbiology of infections. A microorganism, an organism that is too small to be seen without the aid of a microscope. Specific categories of microorganisms are bacteria, virus, protozoa, and fungi. Bacteria. The definition is unicellular microorganism that can be spherical, rod-shaped, spiral, or comma-shaped. They can reproduce by cell division about every 20 minutes. Therefore, they can develop huge numbers very quickly. Endospore, which is a bacteria in a resting, non-active state that allows them to be highly resistant to environment, chemical agents, and physical procedures. It can survive for years and remain non-active until conditions are favored, in which they will then germinate. Endotoxin. Some bacteria are capable of producing this. Toxic to mammals and is responsible for producing high fevers associated with infection. Viruses. The simplest forms of life. Reproduction. Cannot live outside a living cell since they are missing some vital components necessary for their own reproduction. Use organelles and metabolic functions of their host to produce new viruses. Viruses must find a compatible receptor site on the host cell. An example would be a cold sore. Herpes virus only appears on the lip, but even though it does not appear on gum tissue, even though it is exposed to millions of viral cells. This is because there are no compatible receptor sites. Major medical concerns, limited pharmaceutical drugs available, and the ability of the viruses to mutate. Protozoa, unicellular and colonial organisms that display characteristics typical of animal life. All classes are believed to contain some species that cause disease in humans. Transmission is contact with contaminated feces, flies, insect bites, malaria, person to person. Classifications are based on motility. Some are able to form their own environment, which makes them resistant to chemical and physical changes. Therefore, they can survive outside of their hosts, like cysts. Fungi. Variety of forms and sizes. Can be pathogenic or non-pathogenic. Both can cause harm. Some non-pathogenic can cause allergic reactions. Mycosis, a fungal diseases. Survival, live on dead or decaying matter, need an abundant amount of moisture and oxygen. They grow best at warm and moist environment. Ideal environment is warm and moist. They grow best in environments that contain sugar or are slightly acidic. Reproduction, they form spores similar to seed production. Positive effects, widely used in the industry for products like antibiotics, cheese, bread, beer, and wine. Pathogens. The definition is a microorganism capable of causing disease. Presence of pathogens is one of the necessary components for disease or infection. Knowledge is the basis for preventing the spread of infection. Fundamentals of infection. Just because there is a presence of microorganisms does not necessarily mean an infection will arise. There are several factors that interplay with this chain of infection. Fundamentals of infections continued. A pathogenic organism is in sufficient quantity and virulence to pose a threat. I'll repeat that sentence. A pathogenic organism in sufficient quantity and virulence to pose a threat. Reservoirs in which the offending organism can thrive and multiply. a portal of exit through which the pathogen leaves one host, a mode of transport, a port of entry through which the pathogen enters another host, a susceptible host. We have the infection cycle, which was all of those things I just said. Quantity and virulence. Are all microbes pathogenic? Not all microbes are pathogenic. Can a benign microbe become pathogenic? But a microbe that may be benign can become pathogenic in large enough numbers. The chain can be broken by simply hand washing to sterilization, disinfection, and antiseptic techniques. This can reduce the number of pathogens and therefore prevent infection. Reservoir. Microorganisms need somewhere to live and grow. Common hosts are patients who develop infections or disease from these microbes. It is easy to practice proper infection control when the potential harm is seen from obviously sick patients. However, some pathogens live in bodies of seemingly healthy people without causing readily obvious symptoms. These types of people can pose a problem to the healthcare worker. An example is a patient with HIV but no symptoms and a negative blood test. Incubation period may not be sufficiently long enough to develop the marker. Patients are most infectious during this time that they are asymptomatic. Reservoirs can not only be people but also food, water, insect toxins, and wastes. A portal of exit. The definition: the way the infection leaves one host before entering another. What is the most common portal? It would be bodily fluids. An example would be blood is the most obvious, but saliva and mucus can be the atmosphere from a sneeze or a cough. How do you properly sneeze? I sneezed into my elbow. I think that's it. Mode of transport. 4 main routes of transmission for infection: direct contact, fomites, vectors, and airborne. Direct contact is one host comes in direct contact with another. Touch is the most common method. An example would be STDs. The mucous membrane of one host comes in contact with the mucous membrane of a susceptible host. Technologist touches the patient's skin with scabies. A fomite occurs with indirect contact. A fomite object has been in contact with pathogenic organisms. What can be a fomite? A pillowcase. People often touch different things without thinking. Not only about self-protection, but also protecting the next person or patient contacted. Studies suggest that healthcare workers are not diligent in washing hands after using the bathroom. That's disgusting. How do you properly wash your hands? Do you touch the exit doorknob? A vector occurs with indirect contact. The definition: an animal or an insect that transmits an infectious microorganism to a host as a vector. Examples: mosquitoes that give malaria, ticks, Lyme disease, birds, West Nile disease. Airborne occurs with indirect contact. Contamination is spread by water droplets or dust. Coughing, sneezing, or even speaking propels droplets into the air. Portal of entry. The definition is path through which a pathogen can enter the body of the susceptible host. And examples would be open wounds or minor skin abrasion. Common susceptible portals are the respiratory tract, the intestinal tract, reproductive tract, and urinary tract. The urinary tract is the most common area of infection in the hospital. The ideal host, a susceptible host. The ideal host would be a person with reduced resistance to infection or someone who undergoes overwhelming exposure. Patients are an easy target to be a host because in addition to their primary problem which caused them to become hospitalized, they may develop a second infection after being exposed to the other patients and healthcare workers potentially carrying pathogens. What is the most life-threatening infections? Hospital-acquired staph infection. What is the difference between getting staph outside a hospital versus inside of a hospital? Staph is a relatively benign microbe which can easily evolve into a deadly threat. These particular organisms have been so exposed to antimicrobial agents that they have mutated into strains that are resistant to chemical agents. Nosocomial infection, hospital-acquired infection, pose a threat to healthcare workers. Thousands of healthcare workers are infected with hepatitis B virus every year. This particular strain is highly infectious and requires intensive treatment. Employers now provide immunization shots to their employees. This disease is highly preventable if one has the vaccine. No healthcare employee should be without immunization. Hepatitis, HIV, and tuberculosis. All three diseases are common concerns for all healthcare professionals. Even though universal precautions were created, TB is rapidly surfacing again, per the Center of Disease Control. Viral hepatitis. 5 types of hepatitis virus. They are related by the source and route of administration. Hepatitis A and E is oral to feces route. Hepatitis B, C, and D are bloodborne. Percutaneous and mucosal exposure. B and D can be prevented by the B vaccine. Hepatitis C and E have no preventative treatments at the present time. Human immunodeficiency virus, also known as HIV. First known case was in 1959. The virus reduces the host resistance to infection because it destroys T lymphocytes. T lymphocytes are the body's defense against infection. AIDS virus uses the T lymphocytes as its host cell to replicate. When the virus is released, the T cell dies. Then more new virus in the blood signals more T cells, and this allows for more places for AIDS virus to replicate. The T cells are supposed to kill the virus, but instead the virus uses the T cells to reproduce and then kill the T cells. HIV is the name of the virus. If a person has a positive result from blood tests for HIV, then they are HIV positive. Not all people who are HIV positive have AIDS because the illness has not progressed to that stage. AIDS is acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. The transmission is infected blood and blood products, reproductive fluid. Although the virus is found in tears, sweat, and saliva, no cases of transmission through those fluids has been demonstrated. This is probably due to inadequate amount of microorganisms in those fluids. Tuberculosis. 8 million new cases each year. 3 million deaths. Greatest problem to healthcare workers is the increase in multi-drug resistant outbreaks in hospital and prisons. The transmission is droplet nuclei, airborne particles. Coughing can transmit infection. Infection prevention and control. Stopping any one of the 6 factors of the chain of the infection will stop the cycle. Healthcare workers can employ techniques to stop transmission from the reservoir to the susceptible host, since that is the primary factor that can control. It is important to note that technologists that work when their resistance is low as a result of fatigue, stress, low-grade infection, or trauma will increase their susceptibility. Universal precautions. The CDC published a guideline for healthcare workers to follow regarding isolation precautions in a hospital. They soon revised this guideline to state that precautions should be consistently used for all patients regardless of their bloodborne infection status. Precautions should be universal. This should not be thought of as a universal protection, since droplet, airborne, and contact transmission may need additional protection rather than just standard universal precautions. Universal precautions. Gloves should be worn at all times when in contact with patients or contaminated objects and surfaces. Gloves should be changed after contact with each patient. Masks and protective eye shields should be worn during procedures that can generate droplets of blood or other bodily fluids. Gowns should be worn during procedures that can result in splashing of blood or bodily fluids. Hands and skin surfaces should be thoroughly washed immediately after contamination with blood or bodily fluids. Needles should not be recapped unless necessary. Healthcare workers with oozing or open sores should refrain from direct contact and handling. Medical asepsis. Majority of the infection control and prevention is common sense. Barrier techniques are the front line of medical asepsis. You cannot get your hands truly clean by washing, therefore it is important to always wear gloves. Remember the powder experiment. I have no clue what the powder experiment was. Sterilization and disinfection. Standard sterilization and disinfection procedures are used on patient care equipment. What's the difference? Disinfection eliminates most pathogenic microorganisms, but not the bacterial spores. Different disinfectants have different target ranges. Not all disinfectants can kill all microorganisms. Sterilization kills everything, including bacterial spores. Sterilization is an absolute condition while disinfection is not. Instruments or devices that enter sterile tissue or the vascular system of any patient through which the blood flows should be sterilized. Devices in contact with mucous membranes can be disinfected at a high level. Hand washing and gloving. Hand washing is a major part of the infection control system. It is recommended to wash your hands before and after wearing gloves. Be aware to wash your hands after touching a patient's chart, between patients, after touching the wheelchair or stretcher, or touching the patient's identification band. What is the proper technique to wash your hands? You turn the faucet on. This is stupid. Turn the faucet on, hold hands lower than the elbows, deposit soap onto the hands or wrists, interlock fingers and rub hands together for 20 to 30 seconds. Rinse hands and wrists. Grab paper towels and dry hands. Use paper towel to turn faucet off and open the bathroom door. Hand sanitizers. Many facilities supply alcohol-based hand sanitizers. Pros: reduces nosocomial infections and convenient. Cons: doesn't kill certain bacteria and can't replace hand washing. Good housekeeping. This is another area requiring common sense. Every piece of equipment that comes in contact with the patient, such as gamma cameras, should be cleaned after each patient. Principles: always clean from the least contaminated to the most contaminated area, outside in. Use the most effective but surface appropriate cleaner. Handling linens and uniforms. Soiled linens, uniforms, and scrubs are considered fomites. Never use linen for more than one patient. When disposing linens, handle them as little as possible. Do not shake soiled linens. Gently fold toward the middle and immediately dispose in proper bin. General rule: if you don't know if it's contaminated, do not use it or wear it. Handling sharps. Handling needles is the primary mode of occupational transmission of HIV and HBV. All needles need to be placed in the sharps container. Never recap a needle before disposing, just place in the sharps container directly. Be sure to stay aware of the full line on the sharps container. Overflowing containers are a major source of accidental needle sticks. Employer responsibilities. The employer is responsible to provide a safe working environment for employees. Employers are required to supply mechanisms to protect yourself and your patients. The CDC requires employers to provide initial orientation and continuing education, provide equipment and supplies necessary to minimize risk of infection, monitor adherence to the recommended protective measures. The end.